Great. It looks like we have got lots of people coming in as we're starting this off. I'm going to ask everybody as we start and gently come in, everybody. My name's Latif Chowdhury. I want to say welcome to everybody. And we are starting. But as you are coming in, please make sure you are muted. We're really excited to do the session with you all, but we just want to make sure it's accessible to everybody and there's not too much background noise or anything like that. I'm just going to wait as people are coming in, but if you are coming in, would you please use the chat function just to introduce yourself, just put a line, just perhaps what role you have in your workplace that brings you to today's session, or whether you're here as a parent or a colleague, or maybe both. These are things that really matter. And we are keen that everyone gets a copy of the recording for today's session, of course, but we also want to know what we can do most to support you in this conversation, which is a really heartfelt conversation about neuro-inclusion for all. Can we build support beyond labels? It's a heartfelt question, so please do the chat, and I'm going to take us in a journey with my wonderful guests over the next hour, talking about the ideals of this. And I suppose I'm just going to warm up gently, but often I find that when people talk about labels, they say it with a kind of hesitancy, almost like this space that says that we need them. And it's a shame that we need them, but we need them. And in some cases, there are folks who are deeply liberated by that label. It finally gives a picture or a place to name something that in their heart they were scared to name. And it can be deeply liberating when you have a label that allows you to breathe, to say that you matter, and even understand parts of your childhood that you'd long put away. So labels can be deeply liberating. But I would strongly argue, and I think those of you who follow my work already might be aware of this, but I would strongly argue, yes, they are liberating at times. But socially, culturally, and structurally for people of color, for people facing poverty, and for people facing migration, there is a poverty of knowing about these things. There's a poverty of knowing about neurodiversity. There's a poverty in knowing about assistive technologies and tools. And there's a poverty about just knowing about the safety that could be afforded to you if you come forward in the workplace. A lot of people don't know that. We take it for granted as if they do. So to get that level of inclusion in a healthy place, we're going to have to look beyond labels. Sometimes it's not about who's got a label. Sometimes it's about who dare not wear one. And what do we do about that truth? And is it a truth? I think that's what we're going to explore in the next few minutes and as we proceed. So I'm just going to remind everyone, please use this space, it's your space, to use the chat to tell us why you're here and who you are. And if you haven't done that, please do that. And I'm going to start introducing us. We're going to put questions to each other in the Q&A section, not the chat. But I'm going to introduce myself, and I'm gently warming up as I sort of do. And I'm always a little bit gingerly and nervous when we start these things off. And I don't know if people don't notice it, but that's a good thing. but I notice it, and that's okay to share that. And say it's always a little bit weird when we do these things. You're talking to a whole bunch of folks around the world, and you can't see them, and you don't know if you're talking to yourself. So tell me how you're showing up today, and if you're excited to be part of the learning and the development here, blast away, really. So I'm going to stop talking. There's a little picture of me. I am the CEO of Calling All Minds. I'm really excited to do this work. My work has extended to supporting the United Nations and their inclusion goals, as well as folks like the Commonwealth for Learning and the learning and development needs for people all across the world in terms of participation, particularly children facing disablement. And it really excites me as a person of color to talk about neurodiversity, especially when I didn't see that role model in my own life. So we are an organization that builds inclusion through inclusion passports, as well as training and support. But ultimately, I think at the heart of what we do is a campaign just to make inclusion easier for people, especially those who may be trying to address stigma and shame in their lives. And so that speaks to the heart of what we're doing here. Can we build a world without labels? I'm really grateful to have the guests with me. I've got Nicola Warwick from Partnerships Director. I've got Jess Meredith, founder of Differing Minds, and Nikki Hudson from East County Fire and Rescue Services, which is pretty amazing, isn't it? So I'm going to start by introducing Nicola. Nicola, would you introduce yourself more and tell us a little bit about why you're here? I know that this is an Everway thing, so I would just say Calling All Minds and Everway are excited to do this together, by the way. So I'm going to hand to Nicola.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Atif. So hello, everyone. I'm Nicola Warwick, the Partnerships Director here at Everway. So for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Everway, we're an assistive technology company. We've been operating for around 30 years now. Our tools are used by more than 250 million people worldwide. And in my role, I get to work with really brilliant HR leaders and our amazing reseller partners as well. So we've all got that shared goal. Can everyone hear me okay? Can everyone hear?
Yes, it went to mute for a second.
So I'm also a mum of 2 young children. So building truly kind of inclusive workplaces, it really matters to me. It's something that's important to me, and not just obviously for today's employees, but for that world that my children are going to grow into and the workplaces that they're going to be going into. So that's kind of a vested interest for me and something that's really important. So I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today, and I'm really excited to have the conversation. So thank you so much, Atif.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nicola. Jess, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hello. Oh, thanks, Atif. Great to be here. So my name is Jess Meredith. My pronouns are she, her, and I founded and run an organisation called Differing Minds. And as you know, Atif, we focus on workplace and educational kind of training, as in education settings. So we kind of go anywhere that people will listen and run workshops to bring these topics around neurodiversity to life through kind of storytelling, video, interactive exercises, simulations, anything that can get people kind of really feeling it and really figuring out how to take it forward. So we do that in, like I said, organisations, we do that in schools, we do that in universities, we do it in sports clubs, we do it anywhere that will have us. And I do it because I care about it very passionately, as many of us in this space do. So for me too, it's a very personal topic, and I am trying to change how we think about these things in the world for the next generation.
Brilliant. Lovely to hear. And Nikki, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nikki Hudson. I lead on our inclusion, diversity and equality work at Essex County Fire and Rescue Service. I am absolutely passionate about creating inclusive cultures as a foundation for us to truly benefit people in our organisations, ensure that everybody can thrive as the human that they are. I make no apology for my passion around neurodivergence. Every individual is unique. We all have different brains, and some of those brains are better understood than others. And ultimately, we are, to use a term that we're not all keen on, but we are on a journey to better. And I said just before we came on, for me, inclusion is about the progress that we make rather than aiming for perfection. So yeah, here to discuss what we are doing and what we continue to do to grow at Essex County Fire and Rescue Service to create neuro-inclusion as part of our culture.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, so over the next few minutes, I'm going to ask some questions. I would like you all to reflect on this, those of you who are joining us and listening to this. So we've got 51 folks here so far. I guess my challenge to you all is that many of you may not have had to question whether diagnoses are a good thing or anything but a good thing. Maybe you've never had to really think about the label in a place of powerlessness for some people, that you're in a place where you've been able to talk about it psychologically and safely, or you're in a workplace that can, or you have the role that does it. But so when we do this, if things are challenging, bring it up, raise it in the questions and answers. And I'm going to start really by asking Jess the first question, Jess Meredith. And as we go on, and it will be about diagnosis, it will be about adjustments. These conversations will be about shifting these balances, and they will be about what tools can help make that difference work. Everway make incredible tools to help that difference work. And so when we look about this, how do we access tools to make this work? Some of the best tools we'll ever find are technological and digital, but sometimes they're just people, and they're people that help us feel welcome. So the person who I know is really good at making people feel welcome is Jess. So Jess, I'm going to ask you straight away. First question is, when we talk about neuro-inclusion, as we've said, and you've heard my take on it, it can't just formally be about formal diagnosis and labels. How do we shift the lens to see a bigger picture here? And can we? And in your eyes, do people need to disclose in order to be seen?
So I totally agree, and I think it's really important that we make the point that I don't think that people should always have to disclose. And like you said, some people can't. Some people it's a choice not to. Some people don't know. Some people don't have access. There's all of these reasons. So I think if we focus on that, we're never going to get to the goal of inclusion, neuro-inclusion being one part of that. So to move to how we make that happen, I think there's a lot which is why I think webinars like this are so important, because there's a lot that we can take responsibility for as individuals, right? There's a cultural thing that I'll come on to in a second, but I think as individuals, there's so much that we can do to make people feel safe to be different, which is ultimately what we want. Now, when I work in organizations, but this applies in other settings as well, and this comes from my experience before I ran my own business when I worked for other people, where I think organizations go wrong often is that when you start in an organization, there's so much focus on letting that person know this is how the organization works. This is what we need from you. This is kind of like, you know, all of the boring stuff, our processes, our procedures, this is our culture. And there is so little, if any, of who are you? How do you work? How are we going to get the best out of you? And that can happen at a cultural level, but also it just takes a manager to say to the new person in their team, how do you work? What do I need to know to get the best out of you here? Like, what do you want to know about me? And sharing that can be really powerful. So exactly as you did at the beginning of this webinar, Atif, talking about what could be deemed an adjustment or just opening up about something that affects you and how you are can make people feel safe then to do the same thing. So I wish more colleagues, managers, you know, teachers, anyone working with anybody, whether that's a child or a young person or an adult, just ask that person about them. Not are you neurodivergent or not, and so therefore what do we need to do, but just who are you and how do you work and what do we need to know? And that can open up awesome conversations about neurodivergence if that's relevant and that works for that person, but it could open up a whole load of other stuff and it doesn't need any labels or anything like that. So I would say that for me is the kind of first thing. But even with that in mind, if you're still operating in a culture that doesn't embrace difference, it can be really hard to enable that to happen. So I think in the first instance, anybody who's responsible for shaping a culture in an organization needs to implement one where people have choice and flexibility in how they operate. Because if it's not, if it's this is how we do things, you know, this is how we show up in meetings, this is what we deem to be professional, this is how you must process this information, it doesn't allow people to be different. And this is where we get into this world of adjustments all the time. Whereas if we implement cultures that have choice and flexibility, that's where we see people thrive. And it's not, most of my work is in organizations, but it's not just in organizations. For anyone that follows me on LinkedIn, I put a post out yesterday of I don't know if anyone's seen it, of a letter from a head teacher who was new in post in a school, where he was laying down the ground rules for his approach. And he was a self-proclaimed old-fashioned teacher. And some of the stuff in there is just exactly what we should not be doing. You know, you must all arrive in uniform. If you do not, you will be sent home. You can only go to the toilet in lunch breaks or at break time. You can, you know, just very old-fashioned, not full of choice and flexibility. He even mentions choice in the letter where he says, every child and young person has the ability to make their own choices. Let's hope they make the right ones. But in his head, only the right ones if they abide by all of those rules. So the reason I share it is to just show how much we are conditioned into thinking about conformity and sameness and rules without challenging them right from the beginning, which make things really hard when we get into the workplace. So yeah, I think there's a big cultural piece to do, but also things that we can do at an individual level as well.
Brilliant. Yes, thank you. Thank you. There's lots to be said about that letter that springs to mind, but I'll park it for the moment.
There's lots being said on LinkedIn at the
yeah.
moment, so go chat amongst the others.
And I suspect, I think George has probably put a link to that chat, to the LinkedIn post for you just there in the chat as well. Okay, so it brings up a lot of things that we have the illusion of choice, you know, and I think that's what you've touched on. I often think what is somebody's real well-meaning invitation, even when it's well-meaning, is sometimes an imposition. You know, it's to say, like, prove you're neurodivergent, show us. And maybe that's just a really big ask. And maybe you'll never access technology and tools because you have to rehearse many, many times how you may even ask for such a thing. And you worry about the stigma of that. Maybe you don't, and hopefully you don't. But for a lot of people, they do. And it might not even be in the workplace. So those of you who are leading this work, it may not be because of the workplace they're in right now. In fact, quite often, I think it's not. It's often about the workplaces they were in the past and what marks they leave. And so when people do ask for support and technologies and tools, they're actually giving a gift to the person they're asking. They're saying, I feel safe enough to ask you. You know, it's a real honor. When we get into this towards the end, we'll talk about how to make that easier for people. But I want to ask Nicola a question, really, about this idea of tools, particularly given what Everway do, which is an incredible tool. So I guess my question is really about when we think about how tools, and I do talk about assistive technology as tools, so that's confusing for anyone. I'm talking about assistive technology. How can we make it easier? Is there an example you can think of that where a person asked for an individual adjustment and that became a collective benefit for everyone or more people? Can you think of an example in every way that might have been a case? I can share one as well after, but I'd love to hear from you. Do you think that it's going to work if we're still depending on a diagnosis in all?
Sorry, Atif, do you mean where technology has been offered and then other people have kind of benefited from it as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, technology is it has an incredible kind of potential to level that playing field and really give everyone what they need to thrive. So this could be kind of text to speech technology, for example, for somebody with dyslexia to process information faster, or a dictation feature maybe for somebody with ADHD to kind of capture ideas that before they're lost. But features like these are really beneficial features for everyone, thinking specifically, to prepare for this webinar and, the questions that we were kind of going through and all of my readings and kind of research behind that. I downloaded that all into an MP3 and listened to that because I just prefer, audio format and listening to help digest kind of information. So there's we've seen lots of examples of, our software read and write being implemented within organizations, but then kind of being used more kind of broadly across organizations. And like I say, kind of leveling that playing field to give them what they need to thrive.
And with that in mind, do you think, I think there are many cases where it will be. So I often, if I give an anecdotal moment, I often think in my head that if I've done a good workshop or a good session for somebody, then people will ask me what they liked about it, and they may tell me, or they may know enough about my reputation to say, this guy won't mind me using this technology or this tool. Or if in essence, if I think I've reached out to the most marginalized person in the room, then there's a chance that I've reached out to more of the room, maybe even all of the room. But if I've done it really well, and I mean it really well, then the person who I thought was the most marginalized person in the room wasn't. It's somebody else who was hiding. And they came forward to say something about how useful it was. Because somebody else did the risk. Somebody else did the emotional labor. Somebody else said, yeah, I need a screen reader. I don't need you to know why. In fact, it's not important that you know why right now. What's important is that I just use a screen reader. And how do we get there?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of our customers, Lumen, approached us. Their employee resource group actually initially requested, someone within the resource group requested that software for their neurodivergent members. And then the global chair, when they were researching options, they really recognized that Read and Write offered a more kind of comprehensive solution of tools. So they decided to kind of implement that, not just for the ERG members, but for the whole kind of company. So I suppose like that, the key to scaling, is not kind of framing it as a special accommodation, like you say, but as a resource that really supports the natural variation of human thinking and communicating. So, yeah, like I said, we've seen that with lots of organisations who've maybe approached it originally from like an accommodations point of view, but when they open it up to say like the employee resource group around disability or neurodiversity, or more widely across the organisation for a pilot, a pilot of the software, and people can see where the benefits are more broadly applicable.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really the heart of everyday belonging.
Yeah.
This is just stuff we do around here. It doesn't say anything, just what we use around here. Brilliant. Okay, so my question is now a question to Nicola, and I guess you can answer this in your personal capacity or in the fire and rescue, which fascinates me for so many levels. My question, Nicola, is I suppose is in that way, technology is an incredible leveler. Do you know? It's tools. If you think about how many of us use glasses, we don't think of it as a special tool for special needs. We just think it's just a tool, but it's the most important assistive technology ever made. Glasses. So, and if we think those of us who wear glasses are we disabled just because we wear glasses, many of us won't. We'll just think, no, we just use glasses. But there was a time when being poor and needing glasses meant you were disabled. You can't afford glasses. You can't see. You're in a disabling situation. So I like that we've normalized life to a certain extent in such a way that the most important assistive technology in the world is not even understood as a special technology. That to me is everyday belonging. So I guess in that same context, I want to ask you is tech alone enough to do this work? Do you see the balance between digital tools and human understanding? And what does that balance look like? Can it be balanced? What is it that excites you about that or even intimidates you?
That's a lot. That's a lot, Atif, to ask.
Yeah.
I think we need to recognise that technology is really valuable, but it has no value if people do not understand how it can assist. And it has very little value if people do not take the time and energy to understand differences amongst people. So ultimately, for me, the environment that we create, the culture that we create, whether that be, I'm here talking about a workplace, but obviously there are many, I can see a variety of experience and lived experience within the chat. So there are people here for their children. The environment that we create at home, the environment that we create for people when we should feel at our safest. And I recognise not everybody's safe in their own homes, but for the purpose of what we're discussing here today, we'll keep it on that premise. For me, we're in a society in 2025 where so much of what we do relies on technology, and very often for people in the age groups that we're talking about that are coming into the workplace, that are currently in the workplace, majority of them use a smartphone. And for me, to really understand somebody's preferred way of working, their preferred way of accessing information, their preferred way of processing information, is to get curious about whether A, they use a smartphone, and B, how they use a smartphone. And for me, that's been a real leveler in terms of understanding somebody's desire to use technology, their digital skills, and whether or not technology is the right step for them. Now, for some people in our organisation that joined to be a firefighter 20 plus years ago, we are still receiving resistance to using technology to logging on and accessing email, because many of those individuals say, it's not what I joined for. I joined to go out and save lives. Now, of course, we are trying to level up digital skill and we are encouraging people to use technology. But on the other hand, we have the corporate part of the organisation where we're on technology most of the day. So within our organisation, we need to balance that. We need to really understand how to meet the needs of somebody that works in our fleet workshops as a mechanic versus how to help somebody in one of our corporate support roles that uses a laptop every day. So we need to be flexible. We need to be balanced. And it starts with the conversation. It has to always start with the conversation. So we don't prescribe. It's really important. We can't prescribe. And consequently, we certainly don't need confirmation, evidence of assessment. We work from the premise of, what does this individual need? What can we do to help? And often we're only looking at what we need to do to help when there's a struggle. If we focus on the strengths and what's being achieved, often people are only coming forward when there's an element of struggle, and that struggle is inconsistent as neurodivergence is. Every individual's experience of whether it be neurodivergence, whether it be due to mental health, whether it be due to change in health factors, or whether it be due to changes in their role, is an individual experience. And if we don't start from the conversation and then consider that individual circumstances before we ever get to technology, then we're missing the point. So it has to start for me about the individual, the conversation. So the best tool is our voice, but we can't always rely on somebody feeling comfortable enough to share what they need to share for us to be able to get it right. So it's a constant conversation for us. It requires the right environment to provide the support so that people can be open enough, and then we can look at how we support them. I don't know if that answered, but balance comes from having a desire to understand.
It absolutely did. Absolutely. I think I was really touched by that. Yeah, I'm really moved by that for a number of reasons. A diagnosis for me is a place that for a heart that has nowhere else to go, you know, and it's nearly always in pain. And so when you have folks who say, well, we don't have to dissect you here. If you feel liberated enough to tell a story, then great. And if we're part of the safety that helps you kill shame and be that story, then wonderful. But you don't have to. And I think this is really important. It's so important. Sorry,
No, I was going to say we've come on a journey with assessments. I think only a few years ago, it was almost a golden ticket to access something else. It was almost the necessary to recognise difference. And that in itself comes with its challenges. Not everybody wishes to be diagnosed. Not everybody recognises that they may in fact be neurodivergent and therefore seeks assessment in the first place. But none of that changes the reality of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a human being that's brain has always, in many cases, actually not always, in many cases been that way since birth. And if neurodivergence is acquired, there's been a change in health factors that still needs understanding. If we come away from the point of trying to understand the human before us, and try to keep adding labels. Sometimes those labels are helpful and sometimes they're really unhelpful, but they will always be unhelpful if we don't start from a position of wishing to understand the human that's before us, whether that's a child or whether that's an adult. I don't see that relying on assessment is the future of neuro-inclusion. I believe creating the right environment for people to be open about who they are, how they work, what works well for them is the foundation of what achieves neuro-inclusion. Personally, I think tools are great, by the way, and we are proud to have read and write software throughout our organisation accessible to every individual if they wish to use it. And we empower people with different tools and different solutions, but it starts from the conversation that allows us to understand the human being.
Yeah, something I think as well, Nikki, like that keeps kind of coming front and center to me when you're talking is that idea around empathy, like understanding the person, like paired with intention as well. So a culture that says, you don't have to ask to be included, like you already are, that's the kind of balance that we're working with. So, I suppose the reality in a lot of organizations is even with the best intentions, most neuro-inclusion kind of efforts, they don't reach the people ultimately that need them most. I think it's around like 2/3 of neurodivergent individuals don't disclose that they're neurodivergent in the workplace. So it's about, creating that supportive environment that allows them, but applying empathy and intent, I think is really important, and just something that I was thinking there when you were speaking, for sure.
It's absolutely vital.
Yeah.
Empathy, having enough people with empathy around is important. But in the same way that we can't expect everybody to be great at spelling, we can't expect everybody to have empathy skills in our organisation either. So it's recognising the difference in our people and who does have the empathy, who does have the desire, who does have the intent. And for me, that's why the community of support that we build within our organisation amongst people that choose to come forward to be supportive of another individual, that recognises they may not have all of the answers, but amongst a community of support, we will find the answers or we will find a solution, is really vital. And in the same way that schools that get this right have that pastoral support, for me, a community of support, which is about people in our organisation with lived experience and perspective, and ultimately that empathy and desire to improve situations and circumstances, is absolutely integral. As a public service, we do not have pots and pots of money to keep throwing at a challenge, but what we do have is great people that want to do great things for other people. And when you start from a position of the majority of our organisation get up out of their beds at 2 o'clock in the morning to go and save a stranger's life, it's been really important to me to focus on the empathy and the human experience. And we're not perfect. I'm not going to sit here and profess to say we're perfect, but we have a desire to be better and a desire to support individuals to achieve their best, to thrive, so that together we can be one of the best. That's what's really important for me.
This is absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. There's so much unpacked here. I'm gonna just throw it out to the folks listening as well, and ask another round of questions. I think this is. I really was taken back, Nikki, when you talked about the corporate and then the front line. I guess is I guess the most courageous language I might use. The folks who said, "Oh well, I didn't sign up to do tech emails and things. I signed up to save lives and as you say, the lives of strangers." Even it's a very beautiful sentiment. I also think there's something about the intersectionality of class there, those who have had formal education and those who have perhaps not succeeded in that, and those who may not know ADHD or dyslexia. And Dyslexia Awareness Week is coming up in October, and it's almost like a poor relation to ADHD in today's language. And I think that's a shame because it's still real, as a person with dyslexia and ADHD, but I strongly struggle to understand which of the two affects me most, and it depends on what I'm being asked to do in the day I'm having and how confident I feel with
And
the moment.
isn't that the point? In 2009, I went from a more sort of HR-based role into a specialist equality role as a disability and diversity advisor in another public service organisation. And at that point, dyslexia was the focal point. It was the conversation we were having. It was the neurodivergence we were focused on. We weren't talking in the language of neurodiversity and neurodivergence and the language that we have today. We're talking 16 years ago. So dyslexia was front and centre, and so much has changed in that period of time and continues to change. We can find new research on a daily basis to understand different aspects of neurodivergence. And what you shared there, Atif, is so many more people now understanding multiple neurodivergence, which makes it an even more unique experience. When we're talking spectrum conditions and how they differ, it's so problematic to try and prescribe solution. And that's really where we've been taken. We've been focused on dyslexia, then ADHD and autism start coming up into the workplace. And of course, the reality remains that people have always existed with different brains. We have different language, we have more research, we have more understanding. But the bit that has not changed is that we're all human, trying to come into a workplace or trying to go into a school environment to do our best to get the best outcomes from that day. And I think it's really important that we have that language and that understanding. It's really important that we recognise the difference between an individual with neurodivergence that may experience rejection sensitivity dysphoria when we're about to embrace an appraisal conversation or a one-to-one, trying to educate colleagues about the reality of rejection sensitivity and how that differs from rejection sensitivity dysphoria, and actually how our neurodivergent community are going to be more sensitive to injustice. They're the bits of the subtleties that are creeping into our workplace that I wish I could empower every individual in my organisation to understand fully, because it's those nuances that really make a difference in terms of the experience we give our people. But for me, we come back to whether it be dyslexia, whether it be ADHD, whether it be autism, whether you are one of those amazing individuals that has all three and you never quite know, as you said, Atif, which one's at play. We bring it back to what does that individual need in this moment? How can we support this individual in who they are? And actually, where are we not quite getting it right and what can we do better? And if we can't create the trusting environment around that person to say, I want to help, then we can't achieve any of the information that we need in order to help them. So we bring it back to the human experience. It really has to be about the individual human experience, because the labels are actually in danger. Forgive me, I could cause upset here, but the labels are potentially in danger of getting in our way, because we believe we know what that means, and therefore we overlook the individual aspects of what that means for that person.
Oh, honestly, Nikki, you're stealing my heart.
Sorry, I'm also stealing everybody's time.
Can I add? Do you mind if I add, Atif? Because I totally, I mean, I couldn't like nod along more or like agree with what you're saying, Nikki. I think this is like absolutely it. And one of the frustrations I have is when I see people talk about the prevalence of a difference to try to justify why we all need to know about it. Or, you know, even on this call, we've only really mentioned ADHD, autism, and dyslexia in a way that we've said we shouldn't be focusing on that, but we haven't even mentioned countless other differences that people have under this neurodivergent umbrella. And it's why I actively say I don't do training on ADHD, I don't do training on autism, I don't do training on dyslexia, because it makes no sense to do it that way. I do training on getting people to understand the differences of the human experience when it relates to neurodiversity, right? I can't talk to every single different human experience, but if we all did a better job of understanding that we communicate in different ways and what that can look like, and addressing our own unconscious bias in terms of what we think is the right way to communicate or how people should be communicating. And then we did the same thing for how people process information. And we didn't assume that you have to be able to process information if I'm just telling you. We didn't assume that you have to experience the sensory world in the same way, or that, you know, your attention needs to look like the same thing. And I'm going to judge you if you're not looking at me and if you're not sitting still, and all of these things that are so kind of we're trained to believe from such an early age. That's the level that we need to get people to try and challenge their own mindsets in order to then, exactly as you say, Nikki, value that person as an individual human being and get to understand them. But we have to do it alongside breaking down all of these things that we think are the norms people should be following, because even if you don't think that you think that, you do. I do. I judge people all the time, even though I do this for a living. I desperately try not to, but it's so ingrained in us that if we don't acknowledge that we're doing that, we won't be able to change it.
There's such richness in what everybody's saying, and I suppose we're going to get into that heart of that to be kind to ourselves, to our leaders, to ourselves as parents as well, which I'd often think about. We're not psychic, and we're not expected to be psychic. And even when we face barriers in our own lives and childhoods and even current daily realities, it can stop us from seeing what other people need, because we're perhaps lost in the lack of safe participation that we need. Yeah. And often we look at leaders and we expect them to be psychic at times, and they tread on eggshells, worrying about what they're going to say wrong. And if they say it wrong, then it's going to really affect them. So sometimes they don't say anything meaningful at all. You know? And so those spaces are there. And I think from listening to all of you, what we do seek here is universal design learning. And universal design does not have a destination. And when people talk about journeys, I think it's okay for a journey to be perpetually teaching you something, for a journey not to actually have any kind of destination, but rather an openness to welcome lived experiences teaching you things, not necessarily making you feel shamed or guilty about things, but teaching you things. And then how do you get to a place? Well, you do that with open curiosity. You do that without pathologizing someone's experience, especially when they themselves may not be ready to be pathologized. I think I'm reminded of that. I think about ADHD to a large extent as just a way the brain works and responds. But at times, I would argue that because of learning isolation that comes with dyslexia, everybody with dyslexia has ADHD. You know, I would argue that not everyone with ADHD has dyslexia. And it's really about saying these are social constructs. They are barriers on how people participate. It's not a barrier to a person's identity or being. We just have always learned differently. The world is built up of a place that is a richer place, a more fascinating place, and a kinder place at times, because we all learn differently. We've all traveled. We've all from people who travel and see things and have moved. But at times we face barriers. And those barriers can be about what we're supposed to do in the workplace, to do things the way other people do it, and what's come before us. And I think we can unlearn those things. We can build bridges through these barriers. And so when I think about universal design, I really want people to sort of ask questions around this or reach out to any of the speakers here today. What does that mean? What support do you want? As a leader, it's not my job to catch somebody out when I interview them. It's my job to help them shine so I can make a decision that could really change the organization. How do I do that? I don't do that with trying to see where the holes are in their CV. I do that by making it psychologically as safe as possible for a person to show off what they can do. And by doing so, they're helping me make a decision. That showing off shouldn't be about how animated they are or how gregarious they are, but really how they reach my sincerity. And so we can do that in the workplace regularly. There are inclusion passports and tools. And I think at the end of this session today, we'll talk about how everyone listening here can be part of inclusion passports to make it easier for them and their workplace and their colleagues. But I want to ask a question as we're in the last sort of 15 minutes of the future we choose. And it's a big one, right? I'm reminded of this a little bit because there's something about rejection dysphoria and it came up and Nikki talked about it as well. And it is going to be a little bit sensitive, but I'll do my best to gently get us out of it. We're watching a lot of things happening in terms of kids going back to school and what that feels like, and obviously flags and nationalism, and I think a tool with an intent that wasn't there when the Lionesses were playing. It wasn't there when rugby's played, and it wasn't there when it's a different intent to use this flag, and it's a different feeling when you're seeing it. And rejection dysphoria happens to us as individuals, but we're watching a lot of people of color who are neurodiverse facing rejection dysphoria on a scale and perhaps they haven't seen in their lifetime. And so it's a big deal. So I'm not asking people to comment on that. I'm asking the audience to feel it, where you might be on this, what thoughts you might have given, and how we reach out to the ecosystems of love and the ecosystems of our colleagues and how they navigate children and their aspirations, especially when children are going to school perhaps for the first time and they're seeing this energy. So it's something to think about how rejection dysphoria operates in the world. But I want to move to something that moves us into a place of hope. If we are to get into a place beyond labels, and I truly will say to everyone in the audience, I understand that labels are deeply liberating. I am going to really emphasize I'm not here to take away labels. I'm just here to talk about perhaps our reliance on them may be making it hard for us to make the right decisions, to support people where they need to be supported, and to recognize, as I think Nikki has really said it well, but also Jess and Nicola, that not everyone is safe to tell a story. Not everyone is safe to share a label. Sometimes I think we kill shame when we do tell a story, but not everyone gets to do that. So if we're to think about neuro-inclusion and the idea that we can just access tools like text-to-speech software, like voice input software, like mind mapping tools, and it's just what's here. It's like, I don't need a special pen to write this. I don't need a special anything. It's just here. That is going to be a big part of the answer. But I also think that attitudes are probably the biggest thing that we're going to be facing. So I'd ask you, what are the big attitude changes that you think will happen in the next 5 years that could make this very real? And is it technology alone? Is it something else? Is there what would so I'm going to ask, I'll start with Nicola if I may first, and I'll go around and invite you all to talk about that. What is the big thing that you think is going to change in the next 5 years to make us less dependent on labels?
Yeah, so we touched there on kind of attitudes and behaviors, Atif. And I think that's kind of at the core of it. You know, the most exciting evolution hopefully is going to be that move from those reactive accommodations to more universal empowerment. You know, right now I think organizations are still treating neuro-inclusion as like a support layer, or maybe you know, a compliance measure, you know, something you offer if somebody discloses. So the future hopefully is going to be about designing environments where everyone can thrive by default. So, you know, we're already sort of seeing this shift, and we're excited as more and more organizations kind of move and see neuro-inclusion as a driver of innovation, of performance, and of growth. We actually hosted a webinar yesterday, and Hearst's ESG lead, a lady called Isabel Fields, she put this really perfectly. She said, it's not charity, but strategy. You know, it's the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. So especially as the kind of future, you know, workforce enter into the world of work with greater expectations and more instances of neurodiversity. You know, AI is another one. We've kind of seen it Everway, how it's going to play a role in that kind of shift. So it's already, AI is already unlocking these new ways to boost productivity. Companies are kind of integrating AI across all of their functions. But it's got a huge potential in kind of boosting access and autonomy and impact then for neuro-inclusion. But the key is that it has to be kind of neuro-inclusive AI, right? So at Everway, we are designing some AI-powered support, and we're running a webinar at the end of November, which you can join, and would love for you all to join. And we've got some details at the end of the slides. But yeah, I think moving away from, you know, accommodations towards universal empowerment, and it's a kind of multi-dimensional a project thing, you know, that we can kind of work towards.
Thank you, Nicola. Looking forward to seeing more about that, and we'll circulate that on our podcast here as well as what future ones that we do together as well. That's good. I'm really interested to hear that. I mean, it's going to be important to talk about AI. I'm avoiding it a little bit today, but only because I don't know, I want to break from it. But actually, it is a leveler to a certain extent, and it's the balance that we strike that is going to tell us. But I certainly know, as someone who doesn't spell, the speed in which I can get work done by talking to a device that will then strengthen it through AI. And it's still my words, but it's just spelled better. Do you know? And that's great. Okay, so I'm going to ask Nikki and Jess as well to come into that.
Please go first. Sorry.
Please, yeah.
No worries. Slightly different take on this. What I see over the next 5 years is the strength and empowerment of the many parents being in workplaces, the many parents that are influencing the education system, the many parents that are experiencing this through a new lens and language and awareness. We know so much of neurodivergence is hereditary. And so what we're often seeing, and we've certainly experienced it within our workplace in the last few years, is the number of parents. Let's face it, many parents will do anything for their children. They will do anything to improve the experience for their children. So with that comes an energy, you know, fire in the belly, if you will, to improve the world. And certainly I heard Nicola say it earlier, you know, we are creating the working environments for the next generation. I've seen in the chat many people here are here with neurodivergent children, or because they have neurodivergent children. Actually, often we will do more for the benefit of our children than we would do to benefit ourselves as human beings. Now, not everybody has children, so I'm not making entirely inclusive statements here, but I believe that the energy of those with the empowerment, the awareness that is given to the generation that are currently understanding more about their own children's needs, and as a consequence recognising themselves in what's being determined for their children, I think will have a huge influence on workplaces, on society. We're seeing it on social media. There has never been so much noise as is being created through the human lens of this is how life impacts me. And we only have to look at how much noise is being created and how much those sort of social media conversations are coming into our workplaces with expectation. But when you combine that with knowledge and experience, that becomes the empowerment, the energy that drives change. Combine that with how fast technology is changing, such as some of the things that we've mentioned here today. And I think actually what we will see is people effectively demanding a better outcome for themselves and for others, because it's already started. So yeah, I think technology is changing at pace, will change at pace, but we've also got to consider just how empowered people will be with the new knowledge, the lived experience that they have to fight for the best outcomes for the next generation. And I think that's definitely something we'll see more of and hear more of in the next 5 years.
Nikki, that's brilliant. I'm really glad to hear that. I share a sentiment. I am really hopeful that despite the American and post-American Trump election clawbacks, that we have more conversations and sincere conversations in the workplace about neurodiversity, particularly, and others. But really, it's not really about ADHD or dyslexia or anything. It's just about healthy participation and what are the barriers that we face to address that. But if I am encouraged by parents, but I do wonder, forgive me, and this is where I'd like to just throw it out to, again, not looking for an answer, but just people think we have a school to prison pipeline. It is made up of working class white people and migrants. It is not made up of middle class kids. It is a reality. It is intersectional because neurodiversity is always intersectional. It is not intersectional. Neurodiversity is not intersectional when it's about people of color. It's about who are the people that can access support and who aren't. Who are the people that feel a sense of pride and liberation and who are not. These are intersectional realities. I share these conversations and this passion quite often with many people. But one of my favorite people to do that is already here, which is Jess. So I'm going to ask Jess the question as well. Jess, what keeps you hopeful in this? And in the next 5 years, what do you think is going to change? Are we getting better at this, or are we going to be pushed back because of the wider clawbacks?
So yeah, sadly, what do I hope will happen in the next 5 years and what do I think will happen in the next 5 years are very different answers. So I'm going to take my optimistic view today and give you my hopeful answer, and focus on what I think we can try and change, the people that really want to create this change. And one of the barriers I come up against all the time when I'm talking to people is around the term neuro-inclusion. People have assumed we're talking about ensuring we are including neurodivergent people, right? That's where the focus is. That's where everyone thinks. And they miss that when we're talking about neuro-inclusion, we're talking about everybody. We're talking about including everybody. You don't become neuro-inclusive if you make your organization so one way, to talk in binary terms that I don't agree with, when neurodivergent people are fine and then neurotypical people are not fine. Neuro-inclusion is about everyone. So much of what's been talked about today, I think, is really important because it's not about what are these specific changes we make for these specific individuals or groups or categories. And I really want us to get beyond this neurodivergent, neurotypical thing, because again, like the labels of being autistic or ADHD, etc., are really useful for some. And I do think they're useful where we are now. Being neurodivergent and as an identity is useful now, but I don't think that's where we should be heading. I think where we should be heading is just this individual experience. And one of the things I think we've got to get our head around in the next 5, 10, 20 years is getting a bit of a grip on social norms that have completely taken over in all of our cultures, and they are different in all of our cultures, which is really confusing. Social norms were there in the first place to try to ensure that we could kind of live together alongside each other safely, cohesively, collaboratively, and somewhere along the line they got too much and only focused on certain ways of doing things and too rigid, and so what they've become now is actually limiting and divisive rather than uniting. So I want us all to start to think about, why am I assuming that somebody should be doing this in a certain way? Why am I assuming that this is the right way to, create this physical space. Why am I assuming that this is the right way that we would have this interaction? We've just got to all take responsibility for challenging norms, and figuring out how we can create a world, education system, workplaces that are neuro-inclusive and work for everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jess. Solutions that work for everybody. This is their destination. And it is a perpetual destination. It doesn't stop somewhere. Just as there's no such thing as a fully inclusive document or a fully inclusive webinar or fully anything. But there has to be curiosity. There has to be humility, and there has to be excitement about what we learn as we join others who join us. I've got a tiny bit of time, but not much, but I'm just gonna quickly ask, there was a question, I think, from Gavin. Gavin, hi, nice to see you on here. Gavin, do you still have a question you want to ask?
Yes, I do. And I was just typing it in. I'm probably a little less optimistic about your time frame, and I'll say why. I mean, I'm a linguist by profession, and I think we need to recognize the powerful but the long-term nature of change of people's use of language. So, for example, if you think about how people are perhaps more comfortable using terms like bipolar than they were using manic depressive, that has allowed that area of treatment and recognition by individuals and families to speak more openly. The same is not true of people who may have a psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia, which is still really scary. Unfortunately, I think it's taken over 100 years for people to even begin to speak about depression in a way which is which is less stigmatizing. Yesterday, I was in the pharmacy picking up my ADHD medication, and a man much younger than me, in his early 20s, walked in and said, I just want to talk to someone about my prescription of citalopram. I won't go into the rest of it, but I was struck by the lack of concern that he had by using that medical terminology for the medical treatment. Now, that's taken a long time to get to a place where people can speak about not just the fact that they may be suffering from depression, but the treatments that they are receiving for it. So I suppose my point is that if we want to speed things up, we need to get to grips with the language that we use and to normalize or I don't know if normalize is the right word, but we need to recognize that language is both powerful, but it does take time. And we may, unfortunately, need to therefore go through a huge backlash before we get to a position where we can start to use our language in a more confident way. I think that was the point I was trying to, a jumbled up point I was trying to make.
Okay, no problem at all. Gary, thank you. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. And I'm going to just, if I can do justice to it, I'll do my best. But language has power. And with it, we build relationships with that power and how it teaches us what is acceptable to be talked about and on what terms and what is not and what is still frowned upon. And quite likely and quite often, those with the least power in our society struggle to access the knowledge of support or the knowledge of safety that gives them that support. And this is very true. And for that to change, what we've got to do is look at the terms in which language is used and look at the terms when people participate in it and whether it is safe for people. And I would argue, coming from a migrant background, who didn't really come to terms with neurodiversity till I was in my 30s, but only in my 40s could I talk about it to my own parents, despite building a company around it. It is very difficult for some people who have to do more in the workplace to share. So on that understanding, I want to thank everybody because it's a reality that you've all signed up to. It's something that you've all had the courage to sit with today. And you've looked at the conversations about how we can anticipate this reality and welcome it, how we can be part of technologies and tools that help us anticipate it and build it into organizations we're in, regardless of whether we have a diagnosis or not. And you've heard the courage talked about in the fire brigade, and that we just have a conversation, and there are organizations out there that to do this help. Calling All Minds is one of them, as is Differing Minds, who I strongly recommend you look closely at, and you join us in this work. We will be making sure that everyone is available to look at access passports. They are going to come into the workplace. In October, I will be holding a session with the founder of the UK Employment Charter, Kim Hock, and we'll be talking about this in October, which is National Workplace Inclusion Week month. And we will also be talking about this in a moment that's true to my heart, which is Dyslexia Awareness Week. So we'll hold that space, and it is a courageous space to say, can digital inclusion passports that are based on barriers and not labels, can they make the difference that we're here to address here? Can they really make the courageous conversation easier to have, just as he was spoken? So I'm going to wrap up there. I want to thank my guest, Nikki. I want to thank Nicola. I want to thank Jess. And I particularly want to thank Georgina in the background, who's helped make all of this real. And I hope this has been a session that's been meaningful and sincere, but I also hope it's kept you hopeful. And that's it for me. Please comment, attach yourselves to this work, and be part of the change that really is about sincerity and moving beyond labels. Thank you so much, everybody, and join us in this work ahead.